So since the war in Ukraine really expanded into much more of Ukraine on February 24th, you've most likely heard news reporters say the Ukraine and Ukraine, or your friends. Some of them might say the Ukraine and some say Ukraine. And you might even see online people using different terminology. And you might wonder, like, why? What's the deal with it? Which one's right? And let's answer that. So for the quick answer, Ukraine without the is correct. It's just Ukraine. Most Ukrainians actually consider the Ukraine to be incredibly disrespectful, Russist, and not something that you want to be using if you want to be respectful of Ukraine and Ukrainians. Under Soviet Russia, Ukraine was known as the Ukraine. In Russian, it would be na Ukraine, and na kind of signifies the way that we would signify non-proper nouns for places, like the forest, the hill, the meadow, stuff like that doesn't necessarily have national borders or, any sort of sovereignty to itself. It's just kind of a place. And for, proper nouns, they'd say v. So like it would be v Russia and v Germany and things like that. Places that were identified as having their own government, their own, social structure, their own borders, all of that stuff. So essentially, Russia was telling Ukraine, you're not your own place. So in Russian, it basically translates very, very similar to English, which is why, people called it the Ukraine during the Soviet Union. And all of that is because the world understood it to be kind of a vassal state of Russia. In 1991, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was dissolved, Ukraine became its own sovereign nation. So it was no longer the Ukraine, it was Ukraine. And Russia continued to try and call it the Ukraine, and a lot of the world did not really pick up that Ukraine was its own entity, because Russian propaganda during the Soviet era and after was incredibly effective at giving misinformation to people and really undermining Ukraine's sovereignty. And this all really came to a head in 2013 with the Maidan Revolution, which I'd love to get into in another video, but basically Ukraine overthrew its pro-Russian dictator and kind of began as a true full-fledged democracy. Unfortunately, a lot of people still didn't pick up on it. And then we had, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, which basically, for those of you who don't know, means steal Crimea. And they tried to steal the Donbass by funding separatist rebels. And, that fight had been going on ever since 2014. The war in Ukraine is not a new war, it's just an expanded war. It really wasn't until, February 24th, 2022, when the world really became aware of, oh, Ukraine is Ukraine, it's not the Ukraine. Unfortunately, a lot of people still don't pick up on this, especially older people who, grew up during Soviet times, who just got used to saying the Ukraine and still say it. They don't mean anything necessarily bad by it, but unfortunately, it can be viewed very negatively by Ukrainians and can feel insulting and frustrating. And so that's really why I wanted to make this video, to really educate people to understand why it's important to say Ukraine and not the Ukraine, and it's important to make a concerted effort to say Ukraine and not the Ukraine, even if that's been your pattern of speaking and talking for years. Because it really gives the impression that Ukraine is not a country in its own merits, and that's exactly what Russia wants. That's the propaganda that Russia has been putting out for decades. And now that you know, work to do better.